All right, Erik, welcome to an N of One. Thank you so much for joining me. I know you know a
Sure.
little bit about the podcast. You know a little bit, you and I are friends. It's going to be a lovely sort of walk in the park together. The whole journey of the podcast, and the reason we call it an N of One is because every individual story matters. In behavioral science, we spend a ton of time looking at humans in general, and that is what the science is based on. But in something that is rare, like going into behavioral science, the exemplars actually are the story. And so I want to talk about you, exemplar friend of mine.
Let's do it.
All right. So look, I want to start in the way, way back. I want to talk about like 7-year-old Erik. Like, what did 7-year-old Erik think was going on for him in the world?
7-year-old Eric. I have to dig back a little bit. The only thing I really remember being super interested when I was 7 was two things I really remember. I was obsessed with like planes. I really wanted to be like a fighter jet pilot. Like I thought Top Gun was like the coolest movie ever. And I was really into, planes and flying around. That didn't really turn out to be a thing that I was super interested later on in life. But just that. I was also very interested in dinosaurs. Jurassic Park was another one I was super into. So um, I was trying to think if there's any parallels to behavioral science there. I'm not totally sure that there is, but maybe shows that kind of had a broad array of interests. And I think I've always kind of found my way into pretty like niche topics that I get like really into. I'm sort of a generalist that I have a lot of different things I'm interested in, but sort of pick specific things I kind of get like more deeper into. So yeah, that was sort of first step was like just things I find or think are pretty cool as a 7-year-old, and I just get like really kind of obsessed with them for periods of time. And over time that sort of changed a little bit, but probably definitely curiosity, and I guess it was a little bit of interest, kind of science, things like that, nature, all those things. Maybe some of those.
Did that show up as you went to school? Like, was science kind of your favorite class, and that sort of is that also where you gravitated in an academic sort of setting?
It's a good question. I would say not really. Well, yes and no. So I think like the broader topics of science things like that I was really interested in. I don't think like maybe the academic application of those was always like the easiest fit for me of like really, mathematical, scientific stuff. And honestly, I think I've gotten better modes of thinking that as time's gone along, especially related to behavioral science work. I found myself more interested in some of these kind of more scientific concepts and mathematics and stuff like that. Um, I found those topics interesting. I think the like areas of study that were always kind of more natural to me were stuff like English, stuff like social studies, a little more of the human side of things, like human side of things and communication. So I think I kind of like interest in those topics. Like it wasn't necessarily that I loved like chemistry classes per se, but I liked kind of the broader lessons of those. And then I found myself more interested in, translating that to like how does this come across in like literature we're reading and like writing, things like that. So those are kind of the areas like writing, especially. I remember when I took like, I couldn't even tell you what I got in like my ACTs, but I remember I did way better. No, I'm from the Midwest. We took the ACTs, not the SAT. But really, English was the one that like really crushed it on. So I was like pretty good at communication and writing and things like that. And I suppose maybe that brings some of that, sort of generalist tendencies where like kind of learning a lot of different things and then tying them together in a way that I can communicate.
Well, and communications is a big part of behavioral science. But let's
Totally.
so you're in high school, you're like English class, journalism class, like these kinds of classes are the things that are lighting you up. If I'd asked you then, do you still want to be a fighter pilot? Like where did you think that was going for you in the sort of like I'm going to go off to college and win a Pulitzer? Like what's happening there for you?
Yeah. Man, that's a good question. I don't really remember being in high school having this really strong thought of like, oh, this is what I know what I want to do. I think I was kind of had an attitude of like, I want to study a lot of things, like try a lot of different things and sort of like see where that nets out. And go to like, and I was sort of kind of given this, I think, just, from my parents, from their experience, just from others, just like, you don't have to have your exact focus area in the world figured out when you're 17, right? Just like, do well in school, go to a decent like university, um, get it, do something that gets you like a decent enough job. Then you can sort of figure things out as they go along. So I think I always had like a little bit of a long-term attitude where it's like try things, do something. You're never like locked into one thing. So Yeah, I don't really recall. I knew I kind of wanted to probably go more like the like business side of things, work in kind of industry, but that's obviously very broad. But maybe part of the appeal of that was that there's so many different areas you could sort of take those kind of skill sets and things along those lines. But I was kind of an attitude of like I'll sort of do stuff and figure it out as we go along, rather than think, oh, I need to like find the perfect specialization right away. There's advantages of both, and we'll talk as we kind of talk about our behavioral science journey. And that in some ways, I wish I would have maybe like been a little more targeted early on, but I also think maybe how things have worked in my career, like that approach, has given me some unique kind of aspects, strengths. And
And so let's talk about that because you do go off to college, right? You do have to make some sort of choice. I hear you on the like, trying to keep my options open, but you do end up at Michigan State and you do end up studying, supply chain management and sort of the more business end of things. As you were starting to take those classes, were you like, oh, this feels natural and good and I'm good at it and it feels like a reasonable path? Were you finding yourself sort of forcing yourself to take those classes while you were, being just by being pulled more towards English or more towards science or more towards another direction?
say maybe my attitude was maybe a little more practical in thinking at that stage. I did really enjoy, especially your first couple of years before you pick like what you're exactly you really start specializing in a major. I really enjoyed the like just doing a lot of different topics, like taking different electives, things like that. And I think I ended up kind of picking that focus more of like, there's not something where I feel like, all right, I know exactly it's really fired up about is what I can do forever. I sort of saw, focusing on business, and then specifically I ended up kind of doing the supply chain management programs. I was kind of good at the school that I went to, good program, and kind of had some background with some like family and friends worked in there as well. But a lot of that was like, all right, this is interesting enough, and it's kind of practical in that hey, there's jobs there. There's going to be, I won't be struggling to find a job. I can get a job and sort of figure things out from there.
Yeah.
But looking back, I did take a lot of different classes, and I didn't pick that sort of major or anything right away. Um, I did, in hindsight, a lot of these kind of fit together more closely, maybe. But I took some psychology classes, and I thought psychology was super interesting. I really, really enjoyed those classes, and I was like, oh, maybe I should do a psychology major. But then I kind of thought about it. I was like, well, what am I going to do with that? And at the time, I honestly at the time I didn't even know behavioral science as we talk about it existed as a thing.
Right.
So when I kind of looked at it, I was like, well, for psychology, I'll probably, what am I going to do? Be a psychiatrist or something like that? I was like, I don't really want to go into more of a clinical thing like that. I just don't think that's kind of my like type of area of study where I'd focus on. And even in doing business school, you do get a lot of like consumer psychology. I really liked our marketing classes as well. Um, and stuff like I worked in this supply chain management or logistics procurement kind of area. And in a lot of ways, like I found that interesting because in a lot of in surprising ways, it's sort of in hindsight similar to behavioral science in some ways. A lot of it's about process and bottlenecks. And all right, here's this outcome we're trying to drive that's not happening. There's all these pieces coming together. There's always, and I did some like Six Sigma things like that. It's sort of similar like behavior mapping, where you think through like, all right, what's blocking people? There's always these surprising things, sometimes small, sometimes large, but often are like kind of hidden that are preventing these outcomes that we're trying to drive. So in a way, it kind of all came together, but it was a little more of a look at like, hey, here's something practical that I feel like I'm good at enough, interested in enough that mixes in some of these things. But you know, looking back, I would have done it differently now knowing kind of what I like. But all kind of the seeds of this were there. And I think as we maybe talk through the next steps, I can expand a little more how some of those pieces came together.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense. I know professors of like process science and stuff, these sort of emerging disciplines around sort of like a more scientific approach to sort of the operational side of business. And, there is a lot of vibe there. Like it is similar to behavioral, they're approaching things in this sort of like, you know, as you know, I'm a big fan of the competing pressures model. Like they are thinking of things in the sort of like, there's forward motion and then there's, friction, and we got to sort of balance those two out. And those are the levers that I have to make a process work. Um, whether that
And
process,
and in that there's in that more kind of supply chain management, like global logistics, things like that. There's that more like here's a process for how we can look at these big complex systems with all these different people and figure out all right, where are things kind of like inefficient, where are things kind of not working as well. And it's sort of similar mindset and approach to a lot of applied behavioral science. They're looking like these actions we're trying to drive. We got to figure out why that's not happening. What's tripping up? Just maybe the level of scope and the specific like problems are a little different, but in a lot of ways that sort of learning that kind of mindset, sort of process was helpful in the long run. Of thinking of things from that behavioral science perspective.
yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So you're in school, you go through this, you're like, okay, I'm going to go do some sort of, something along this line. You end up at IBM as a managing consultant. Tell me a little bit about like those first couple of years of starting to sort of get into the working world and discovering your sort of finding your feet, inside of at Caps and stuff.
Yeah, so I guess sort of a similar, I guess similar theme is that like, all right, so I kind of took a little more practical approach, thinking about like kind of major, thinking a similar practical approach and thinking of like getting my first job. And then, it's sort of like been driven to me by kind of mentors and stuff to like, hey, your first job is not your lifetime career, right? It's like you need to kind of get started, start building income, start building skill sets, kind of get real world. And I think I kind of was drawn to consulting for that reason, where I was like, I don't totally know exactly what industry I want to focus on, what exactly my skill set wants to be, but I like the idea of doing something like consulting where I could ideally like try a lot of different things and sort of learn these processes of like improving different systems, identifying problems and solving them for our clients and things like that. So I viewed it as kind of an opportunity to learn a lot of different things and sort of take those experiences and think about, all right, what's kind of standing out? What am I kind of finding that I'm gravitating towards, that I'm interested in, and things like that. So I kind of took that again as like a learning approach where let's try a lot of different projects, work in different areas, and think about where I kind of want to double down from there. And some of that came from the stuff I was doing in my day-to-day work. But I also spent a lot of time outside of work just trying to read, meet people doing different things and sort of find all these different areas that could be interesting down the line. And that's really how I kind of stumbled into behavioral science in the first place, was doing some of this exploration reading. At some point, I think I was reading some, this is back like blogs were a big thing. I read some blog at some point that mentioned nudge, the book. And I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Like I said, I'd taken some psychology classes and like there were sort of these patterns that in hindsight I can sort of see. And when I read that book, it kind of all came together for me where I was like, oh, I'm kind of seeing all these like random things I've always found fascinating, but have never really been able to put together as like a discipline or a way of working. I just never seen it packaged that way before. And I just didn't know that was kind of a thing you could do, right? And everything, I feel like everything really clicked for me at that point. I was like, oh, this is kind of the area I want to focus on, is this like understanding of people, and how people operate in systems, in different environments, and why they don't do things they want to do, or why there are things that or they say they want to do that ideally are good for them, ways like that. And that whole concept really brought together for me. That kind of, I don't know, when I read that, I was like, all right, this is the one I want to go into more. So I started digging into more like similar books. So I tried to like start meeting people that were doing this kind of thing. Just figured out, all right, what would this mean as a career potentially, or something that I could spend time working on, thinking about things.
And did you think that this was going to be a flavor of the thing you were doing at IBM, or did you have the sense that like this is a job I will go get somewhere?
In relate to that sort of behavioral science focus.
Yeah.
I honestly at the beginning I didn't really know. So again, this is a new thing. Like I did not know. I had never heard the term behavioral economics until I, read Nudge probably like 2 years of my career, right? Again, I was familiar with psychology. I was familiar with some like marketing, consumer psychology stuff. And again, in hindsight, a lot of those things I can see the patterns there, but I just never seen put together in that way. So a lot of it in the beginning was just figuring out, all right, what does this mean? Like, is this a career? Like, what would this mean in terms of what type of work could I do that I could do this? Are there skill sets that I'm missing that I would do with that? So for a while, and honestly for like years after that, kind of talked a little bit, and that kind of kickstarted a journey to figure that out. It's like, what does that mean? And, at the time it was pretty ill-defined. Like now, I thought like, the first thing was, all right, maybe I should go to grad school. I spent some time looking at grad school, but right now there are like good behavioral science programs, like very specifically, like UPenn is a really good example. Like if that existed, that would have been a no-brainer. Be like, all right, this is where I'm going to go and like study this. But everything was pretty like scattered. A lot of the best, like Thaler, for example, the authors of Nudge, he's a professor at a business school mainly. And a lot of the big like researchers and authors were in business schools. I was like, should I go to business school? I was like, well, I don't know if I like need to get an MBA to do this. And then it's like, oh, I don't want to study psychology. And then it's like, all right, is a cognitive psychology, master's going to do it? There's something that felt like it fit exactly where I was at. And it was really just a long process of like discovery to figure out what that meant. And I figured out over the long term, we can talk through some of the like process of that. And it was kind of messy journey in a lot of ways, but it was really just a long process of figuring out what that meant for me specifically and what that really it meant just like a field. And at the time, really all of us were figuring out what that meant as a field.
Yeah,
That's
it's
why it
it
was a
one
fun,
of
exciting time to be in it, but it's, there wasn't a clear path. I kind of had to figure out what that meant for myself.
yeah, one of the clear themes that emerges, having now done 50 episodes or whatever we have of this podcast, is there's a huge generational divide between people who had the opportunity at the college level to go into behavioral science and those who did not, right? So you get people like Pete
Totally.
Judo, who's like, yeah, I majored in behavioral science in college, which like, what? Like, Barry Schwartz was my
Crazy.
undergraduate advisor. Like, if
Yeah.
anybody in the world should have been able to do that, it should have been me. But that's just like not a thing. I remember
Yeah. Yeah.
when Barry got invited to his first TED to give his first TED talk, and that was back when it was a big deal to be invited to give a TED talk. He had no idea why anyone would want to talk to him. He was sort of like, I do this social psychology decision making stuff. I have no idea why this business conference wants me to do this thing. I'm going to do it, but I don't really understand. Academia was still very academic. I mean, it had no notion
Yeah.
that there might be a world out there that was hungry for this. Before I graduated from Swarthmore, uh, I helped with a project for uh, one of the major like Office Depot Staples things, where they had come to us and been like, "Can you consult on like skew reduction in order to improve decision making?" And it was really the first time that any of the professors had ever talked to anybody in a company who wanted to do so. Like, it just boggled their mind that there was somebody like willing to pay us to figure out that problem was a totally, totally foreign concept.
Yeah. And, part of that too is like all the pieces were there within different programs, but it wasn't like unified in one way. And, even I think in hindsight, it's like, all right, if I was going to do undergrad over again, knowing what I know now, it's like, I would definitely maybe I would major in like statistics, for example. It's like, good grounding in statistics is really important. I think it's really important for doing good behavioral science work. You don't need to be a statistician. You don't need to be a full like data scientist, but that's a skill set that is somewhat foundational, would have given a really good foundation for all the other things that I could fill in with some of that, right? So I could see in hindsight, if I kind of knew a little more of this approach could be, or the opportunities, like there's many specific things I could have done to start building the skill set a little more strategically, without having that, broader program. But at the time I just didn't know what that was. And people are getting in the field now. It's nice you have one of those opportunities. I'm glad. I'm glad it's a little more like clear.
Well, and one of the reasons it's more clear, and I want to make sure that we talk about this, is things like Action Design Network and stuff, and the community that has been built around behavioral science. But that wasn't your first community effort, right? So talk to me about Night Owls and sort of this like late night
Yeah.
co-working, like so before behavioral science and Action Design Network, now BeSci, and like before all that, you had other sort of community focused aspirations. Like, where was that coming in for you? Where was that coming from?
Yeah, wow, we're going way back. I haven't thought about some of this in a while. But I think a big part of my approach was community. I don't really like the word networking, but I guess for lack of a word, you could say it's like networking. But I was viewed as like, again, I sort of had this experimental like development approach where I don't need all the answers right now, but I need to be like doing things to meet people doing different things, get exposure to different areas, and figure out where I find myself in relationships well, where I find like things fitting in. And the behavioral science area was one way once I kind of got exposed to that um, a lot of how I ended up getting in the field was through communities, like helping out with action design, which is called BeSci now, uh, and meeting people. But also folks in other communities. Like at the time, I was really intrigued. Again, another area I guess I just like when I was an undergrad just didn't really think of as much was more this entrepreneurial like sort of startup kind of sector. And that was kind of at the time when I was really in my career was startups and things were becoming more of a thing at the time, like a bigger kind of focus area. And I was really intrigued by that. And I started like volunteering with some groups that were focused in that area just to see. Again, it was a way for me to meet people working on a lot of different problems, doing really creative solutions to those, taking sort of an entrepreneurial mindset, which again was just something that I just hadn't really thought of before. I just sort of took an approach like, yeah, you kind of get a job, work there for a while, and I hadn't really thought at the time, like, oh, you can kind of start your own thing, do that, right? It was kind of like this magical idea. Um, and I think combining that sort of experience with as I was growing and learning more about behavioral science, you see those kind of connections there and start seeing how, oh, the more I understand about people and how people act in different ways, where they get hung up in their, attention action gaps and stuff like that. how that all feeds into, all right, this app someone's trying to develop, like why are people not using it? I started like seeing all these kind of patterns, right? In a broader way. But yeah, a lot of it was just an approach of just like I wanted to meet as many people that were doing interesting things that were kind of energizing, inspiring, and again, like seeing where's like people like I want to work with, type of problems I want to solve, things like that. So it was just generally an exploratory approach of this. How do I learn, meet a lot of different people, and sort of see where the chips evolve?
And I think your point is well made, sort of related to the majoring in behavioral science in undergrad point. It is hard for people to remember that entrepreneurism was not sort of thought of in the same way. You know, as you know, I have a 10-year-old bear. Like when I try to explain to him that like it never occurred to people that they could start a startup or that we even used the word startup unless you lived in a very particular pocket of the country where that was a thing, nobody talked about that. Whereas, for him, he's seen YouTubers and like entrepreneurism is infused so much in youth culture as it exists today. People just had it's a self-evident and obvious path that they could go down that just didn't really occur to us at the time, right? It wasn't,
Totally, yeah. Like again, it's like it seems funny to say in hindsight, but it's not something I really thought of. It's like, and in some ways, that's an awesome opportunity for people who are younger. In a lot of ways, this technology's kind of enabled that, where there are just it's a lot easier in some ways to do your own thing. And that doesn't always mean like building a massive company or something, but again, being like a creator or like doing something online. Like I've been a self-employed consultant for a number of years now, and like technology's really enabled all that, and that really kind of blew up in that sort of maybe like decade or so after I graduated, where that just became more of a cultural thing and also more of a feasible thing, the way that technology and the economy kind of worked and things like that. So, uh, and that's why, again, in hindsight, it could have been helpful to maybe have a better focus in the beginning, but there was a lot of change happening, a lot of growth, and taking an approach of how can I learn a lot of stuff, try different things, see where it goes. Like that's it. That kind of worked out too.
yeah. I mean, talk to me about so you're working at, a mega company, management consultant at IBM, right? In the day, you're staying up late with, other thinkers at night and getting immersed in entrepreneurism and things. How did you, how did action design end up sort of on your radar?
Yeah, so when I kind of started diving into this world of behavioral economics, at the time it was behavioral economics is kind of the bigger term. Now we kind of use broadly behavioral science, right? But as I was digging into that, I was trying to read every book I could find, read all this kind of stuff to like how to learn what's going on here. But again, I want to take an approach too of just like who are people that are doing this kind of thing? 'Cause again, I knew I was really interested in this. I had no idea what it would mean as far as like a job. It's like, are other people out there that I can learn from that are doing this kind of thing. And I don't even quite recall how I stumbled upon this. Actually, you know what? I think I do kind of remember. So I was doing all this, and I was like, I was doing some kind of like networking, a little bit of volunteering. Kind of, I lived in Washington D.C. at the time, in like the startup scene there. So I was just kind of curious about it. And somebody I was like doing somebody I knew was trying to start a company, and they were in a kind of like venture accelerator. I feel like it's maybe not as much of a thing now, where there's like they pick a batch of companies, they kind of help them, give them resources to, scale up, build up, things like that. I knew somebody else who just like a little bit of help on the side, just to like do some things, like build some skills, kind of see what this was like to be in this kind of environment. And as I was looking for these opportunities to meet people, and through their accelerator, they I don't remember how I got the info for this, but basically, like Steve Wendell, who has been like a kind of mentor to me, um, he was giving a talk at the time. He was working at a startup called Hello Mom, it's like a personal finance startup in DC, and he was really pioneering, I'd say, like using behavioral design principles to help build out digital products. Drive behaviors. Using a lot of these new like apps, like digital technology was kind of like a new thing at the time. And he was giving a talk on this at this accelerator that my friend was kind of working through. I think it was like a lunch and learn kind of thing. And I was like, that popped up. I was like, oh, I've got to go to this. Like, I was like, oh, wow, here's somebody who's like really doing this kind of thing. Right. So I went to this kind of thing and I introduced myself. I was like really interested in this kind of thing. And, we kept in touch, and then we got coffee sometime shortly after that. He was talking about, I was like, oh, he was trying to start a community focused on behavioral science with DC, which ended up being the Action Science Network, which now is a big kind of international nonprofit with communities all over the world and things like that. But I had some experience already working with some of these startup communities, just kind of help put together events, like get to kind of collaborate and things like that. So I was like, oh, I'll volunteer my time to help kind of put together this group and help just things like that. And we would do like monthly meetups where, someone who was in the field, either was doing some sort of practitioner type of work or research would share what they were doing. People who were interested in it would kind of come and network. And I kind of started volunteering do that. And that's really where I think a lot of my kind of opportunities started accelerating was again just meeting people that were either already sort of embedded. So like Steve himself, like he had a academic background, a lot of this stuff. He was doing it very actively, like documenting what he was doing and sharing it broadly and kind of building out their products at Hello Wallet. But then also just meeting a lot of people that were not necessarily like behavioral scientists, but were working at design firms or startups or something where they're like, hey, this is could be an interesting part of what we're doing. And that's really where I started just kind of seeing where these different opportunities were, what people were interested in, what type of things people needed help with, and how sort of behavioral science fit into that. And also just getting to know people that were either had studied in the field or were kind of doing it in some kind of way actively, like what those skill sets actually meant, and what that would mean to like make that into a job. So I was lucky to meet, some good mentors like Steve and start kind of building out a community to that. And, sort of kind of like following opportunities.
Yeah, and DC was, is a uniquely fertile place for that, right? At the same time, I was the head of behavioral science at Thrive at the time, but in New York, in some ways, sort of the other community, it sort of got swamped by other communities, right? That there was so much energy around entrepreneurism as an alternative path to sort of finance in the sort of classic Wall Street version of New York. Um, there weren't sort of design meetups in quite the same way, right? Just because there was this very powerful conversation that was very business focused. I think it's where, it was quite lovely that it sort of sprung up in DC. And then, you then, you do the conference, Design for Action, right? That's 2014 or so, right? And then you make your way up to like doing Ideas 42. When did you decide, hey, like I'm gonna take the risk off, exiting IBM and really going and doing this other piece?
Yeah, so I'm a little lucky in how that worked out because I think I'd sort of figured out, all right, this is kind of where I want to focus. It was hard to figure out what that meant and what that like, all right, what skills do I need? Because as we'll kind of talk as we go in the conversation, I mean, doing applied behavioral science can mean so many different things. There's a lot of different skill sets that can be involved in there. In some ways, you got to decide like, what's my kind of core thing going to be where I can kind of do this. And again, at the time, this is all still kind of fuzzy. And again, I'm always interested in a lot of different things. So it was like, all right, what's this like right path? So I was pretty active in the community. I was learning a lot, I was meeting people wherever I had the chance to like spend, evenings and weekends working on stuff to kind of learn some of these, apply some of these skills and do things. I was doing it. But taking that leap to like, all right, getting a job was sort of a tough next step because it just wasn't clear what that meant. And what would that job be? Like who's recruiting this thing that I want to do, right? And how would you do that? Um, I ended up being kind of fortunate because again, I was doing a sorry, it's a phone call. To go distracted there. So I was volunteering with them and kind of looking at these opportunities, but I didn't quite know what they would mean to make that leap. And I ended up kind of seeing that, at the time, Ideas 42 still is one of the premier, at the time, there was very much still one of the premier places. At the time, it was really one of the only few places really focused on this kind of thing. And they were always really on my radar, just like they're doing really interesting work. And through kind of the network that I had built, an opportunity came up where they were looking for they do a lot of like, they're a nonprofit, but they do these kind of like consulting projects in a nonprofit lens, these different kind of focus areas and things like that. And um, they had an opportunity open for basically like a program manager to help like manage the different projects that they were running, to bring a little more some of that like consultant organizational sort of stuff to like some of the things they're doing. I was lucky because that's kind of what I was doing in my day job. I was really a program manager for these bigger, I was working mainly like big government contracts. So I was doing a lot of this basic program management stuff of just like managing the financials of a project, like organizing project plans, like, managing all the different developers, all these kind of things. So that was kind of the skill set I was doing. And that's what I kind of, for talking about core resume, skills and experiences, that's basically what I was up to. And that really jumped out when the opportunity came up. I was like, oh, this is a good opportunity for me to have sort of like a bridge into the field, where I can maybe take skill sets I'm doing and get into a firm that's really doing this kind of stuff, using my kind of existing skill sets to kind of get into the field and start building out some of that like broader skill set for behavior science stuff. So, in a lot of ways, it wasn't actually like intentional to get into that opportunity, but it came up, and again, it's sort of like right place, right time, but also in building the community. And at that point, I had people who kind of vouch for me, and I happen to have a practical skill set that was needed, that sort of got me in the door, to kind of get started there. So yeah, I was kind of lucky to like, and I would say that's good advice for anybody who's trying to maybe transition careers, is that it's really hard to make the leap from like the thing you're doing to the new thing. Wherever you can maybe find overlap, where it's like, oh, I can kind of get into this industry using the skills that I have, then build these new skills. It's a really good way to go about it. But sort of like lucky that came up and then it worked out that way. But that's how I kind of bridged myself into the next step.
And so if you fast forward a couple months into the job, was it what you thought it would be, right? You had like been wanting to figure out how to make this a career. You've been active in the community. You sort of gotten to a place where you're like, you make this leap into what is the premier organization for it at the time. You're 6 months in. Were you like, oh yeah, this is it, and feels good, and this feels like what it's supposed to feel like, or was there a sort of like, oh man, maybe these gears are grinding, and this isn't what I thought it was?
I think no, it was definitely, it was a really exciting time. I mean, I really loved getting there, being at sort of the meat of it, and like seeing how people who kind of had, I'd say, the skill sets and roles I was looking for, like what they were doing, how they were thinking about it. Honestly, in a lot of ways, it's just fun to be like working with people who like nerded out on the same stuff I nerded out on, like within like a workplace environment. So it was a really fun opportunity. I think it still took some time to think about like, all right, still what does this mean for me as like a practical skill set to build? And like, how do I like learn this through the job I'm doing? How do I kind of keep finding opportunities to keep building that skill set? So it's really exciting. I think it definitely did confirm like, all right, this is definitely the area I want to go into. But it was still pretty ill-defined on what that would mean going forward. And in some ways, you could say it still is in some ways. It's like there's not a defined path for being in behavioral science. There's so many ways about it. So there's still a lot of decisions to make of like, what skill sets do I need to keep building? Where the industries, not even industries, where are the problems I'm most interested in solving, and like how do I want to help solve those, right? So again, it was like a really good learning experience, and confirmed my excitement that like this is the area I want to be in. But then I was like, all right, how do I kind of double down on this and like find the next step for myself, to keep kind of building out a career.
And then, Morningstar buys Hello Wallet, and your mentor, Steve, like, in what I think is a great step forward for the field, takes this very prominent, very like big company version of behavioral science job, which I think is, in the evolution of the field, this is a necessary thing. It has to happen, right? In order for the field to like evolve and change, we have to figure out how to make it into big companies. I went to Microsoft, you went to Morningstar, like we do this next step portion of the thing. Talk to me about transitioning to Morningstar, what made that decision for you, what you were hoping to get out of it, how it, working with Steve and sort of developing, because again, you start to pick up some of these more quantity skills, right? This is, you're doing more R and Python and things. Like, talk to me a little bit about this transition.
Yeah, so it's another way where in some ways I look back and it's like sort of fortuitous, where it's like things worked out in like a nice way in hindsight. But I was learning in Ideas 42, kind of those projects. In some ways I was learning a lot, but also realized how much I still had to learn, because a lot of people I was working with that were doing the type of projects that I wanted to work on were had a lot more of that kind of academic background. They had like really strong skills in like research design and like data skills and things like that. I was like, all right, these are kind of some ways where I need to kind of, excuse me, build up that skill set. And again, I was still kind of like learning other things. Like I was kind of interested in like marketing, for example. And I was curious about like learning some skill sets there. Did some kind of like side projects, work on some things like that. But what ended up sort of happening was when, and I was so many good in touch with Steve. I started running an action design chapter in New York that I started was running. So again, I kind of had the community aspect, and again, this is at a time where there's a lot of interest in this field. There was like, the startup scene was really exploding in a lot of ways. So there's like, I've seen so many cool ways to kind of do this kind of stuff. But just kind of figure out what that path was. And, after spending my kind of time there, and I was thinking about what's that sort of next step going to be, and where would it kind of go? And I got lucky that, Steve was a great great mentor, got that opportunity to start the team at Morningstar. And it was mainly, as he started building that team, it was mainly kind of like people that had that sort of that research skill set, like people that have done, their own kind of studies, big experimental design, stuff like that. That's the type of thing I was still kind of lacking. Like I couldn't run a PhD level research study or anything like that. But I could kind of understand the broad contours of it. And I think working in this more like maybe marketing, like digital products areas where we're like, hey, I know this like broader understanding, but I can like take my sort of business consulting experience, take those concepts to like how to make these like more like easily applicable to teams, people within bigger companies, and apply those kind of methods. And that was kind of the one thing Steve was looking for in the team was somebody to be a little more of like a internal consultant within the company to work with primarily marketing, but also within products like design, even like all these different areas of the company saying, take the sort of experimental behavioral science approach and be the sort of consultant to help people apply it within the company. So that's again where I got sort of lucky where I had enough of a broader skill set of maybe the more process scientific stuff. I've done a lot of work to really stay in the core of like the actual psychology. But again, kind of come back to that consulting skill set where it's like I'm used to working with a lot of different areas, quickly identifying problems, like managing kind of relationships like that. That was a way for me to take those skill sets and start applying in a really core behavioral science way. Sort of like a lot of goals like spread the application of this and say like, hey, we should run A/B tests on things we're running. We should take a defined target behaviors for the things we're trying to do. So I was able to kind of take that skill set of like being good with finding projects, managing a bunch of different projects, a bunch of different areas, and lean on kind of stuff I learned out, but also the expertise within the team to say, what's this kind of like behavioral science approach look like? And I'd say that was my first role. That was really the most like I was strictly doing behavioral science stuff at that point. Where I was like, kind of really friendly doing.
Got it. And talk to me about working with somebody who, had mentored you and was a little farther along in the field. In that, Ideas 42 is a little bit of a chaotic sort of chaotic good, but it's chaotic, right? Josh didn't necessarily come from a behavioral science background. He really brought that consulting into it. You had sort of an academic piece. Then you get a chance to go to like a big company where, you've got somebody you've worked with before you really like. Talk to me about that sort of like transition from a consulting organization and sort of a nonprofit organization into what is a very large publicly traded sort of like company.
Yeah, I mean, I benefited a little bit from the experience in both kind of roles at that point. So working in a big consultancy and working in different areas, and then working within more of I mean, the time I did work was really kind of like a startup at that point. Like they grew in size a lot during the time I was there. And it really was kind of a startup environment, even though it wasn't strictly a startup in that sense. It was a nonprofit. But seeing like that sort of like lean mentality, working with like small resources to like take our expertise and drive it. And I was fortunate also at that point to see a lot of ways the stuff's like applied. Ideas for two works a lot of like international development, some of these big like societal problems and stuff like that. But it also through my previous experience and also just kind of my networking with the community and stuff, knew more about like how it's applying in like the technology space and like the business world and things like that. So I was able to like kind of marry those two together. And in some ways, it wasn't as big of a transition as I might have seen because for one, like our little behavioral science team was kind of its own little startup within the company. So, we were this kind of core team doing these kind of cool things. In a lot of ways, I was sort of familiar with that from like working days for team, for example. And also, when I was doing my, consulting stuff, I would be within big government agencies. So it's just to like work within, bureaucracy to an extent to just like these different like organization structures. Um, so in some ways it was marrying all of those together, but it was definitely a new experience to be like, all right, you're focusing in one place that has like these group of customers, and you're really just looking like this specific area, this industry, this area. So that's what was like unique, and then a lot of it was just putting everything in the test. It was like, all right, how do you? And it was we were preaching a test and learn, process, and it was very much a test and learn process for myself and for the team as well, saying like, what do people pick up on? Like, what are the problems they really need to solve? How do you start? How do you find the right place to start and kind of get buy-in so you can work on bigger things? And I learned like so much like that I still apply to this day, thinking about like, what's supposed to introduce people to stuff? How do you provide value quickly? How do you like focus on the right things? I think a lot like part of the biggest thing I sort of learned was like there's the optimal way of doing things that you want to get to, but where do you start to get to that point? Because in the beginning, a lot of it was like we're really focused on like experiments, like A/B testing. And it was really like driving on that. But it's like people aren't necessarily ready for that. Like maybe they don't have the like data in place. Maybe they're just trying to get things done. So it's like, all right, how do you like provide that value quickly? And I think it's a great thing about behavioral science. There's so many ways you can provide kind of early value, but you've kind of got to figure that out first and really meet people where they're at so that you can figure out how to kind of build from there and get to this point where maybe get to what we think is that optimal process.
Yeah, and that's, I think, you brought up a couple of times throughout this conversation the sort of difference in speed in different environments. And it's certainly true, right? Academia traditionally, you know, it's a very careful aiming process. You design it platonically as good as it could possibly be, and then you finally run the thing, as opposed to, I've made 8 iterations of this. At the time it took you to run that one thing, I've done it 8 times and I've revised it 8 times and I've tried to make it better and better and better. And, I've gotten iteratively closer to what good looks like. Um, I think that scrappiness. I have to think it's a well-made point that, at this stage of behavioral science, and even now, you're always in startup mode, right? Even if you're a big company, it's a startup inside of a big company, right? Everything can be atomized. Walmart is
Yeah,
a million individual people, maybe a million people collectively, but it's still a million individual people trying to do things and get through the day and
right.
live their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why? And so you're there for, almost 4 years. Talk to me about deciding to transition to sort of this epoch of your life where you're doing a lot more individual consulting. You're working across a wider variety of projects and things. Talk to me about like sort of what drove you in this direction of like, because you could have gone from Morningstar to, Bank of America and done the next thing there, or whatever, like got the next corporate version of this job. They do exist, people have them. What made you say, hey, that's not the path I'm on?
Yeah. So again, it was sort of how things fell in some ways. It wasn't like ways totally strategic, but I think, and when I talk with people who were kind of aspiring behavioral scientists, I'll kind of say too, it's like the advice I always give is like you want to kind of have like a core skill set that you rely on where it's like, hey, like I can do data science by doing behavioral science, or I can do design by behavioral science. Because like especially in big companies, like I was kind of a subject matter expert. Um, there's not a clear path of advancement when you're a subject matter expert. It's not like, hey, you're the
You're
assistant
now the
subject matter
senior
expert. Now
subject
you're the
matter
director.
expert,
Yeah, yeah. And
the
you can like do
VP
that
of
to,
subject
yeah,
matter expertise.
right. You can do that in some ways, but then it's like, all right, what's like sort of that next step? And I think like as far as like career growth goes, it's like you sort of hit like a local maximum where it's like, all right, I've kind of applied this. There's always more you can do to grow. But as far as like a role, it's like eventually like, all right, you probably have to switch and get into the more traditional paths. Like you have to lead a team and maybe like move up in this department function, whatever it is. So I was kind of thinking, it's like, oh, do I want to stay and maybe do this, which is not a bad path. And I think in a lot of ways, uh, if you do want to have an impact in behavioral science, like being within traditional structures is a good way to do it because you can show like you get more influence and you have more ability to make bigger decisions and things like that. So I could kind of consider that. But part of it was that I was already sort of doing this sort of really my whole career, I've been doing some sort of like consulting. That's kind of what everything's kind of come down to. So work on projects, find different ways to add value. Especially within that role with like Morningstar, I wasn't like on one team. I was on the behavioral science team, but I was mainly working with other teams working on projects. So I was already sort of doing this sort of consultant thing where I was like, maybe I could just do this in like a broader sense. And just, through especially that early kind of community and networking where I was talking to people who were doing kind of startup stuff, I was kind of like, I was attracted to that sort of like entrepreneurial path in some kind of ways. So I was curious about that. And I sort of figured like, all right, maybe I'll just like try this out. And it doesn't, maybe it won't work. Maybe I'll just like go back, but I figured, you could kind of always, I can find a different job if I need to. But the other thing too is I try not to take like too much risk on. It's like part of it is that I did have people ask about, hey, could you do this project for me? Do these kind of things. I knew there were some kind of opportunities I could kind of get started with, so I wasn't like, totally at square one, where I felt like there'd be like a starting base to work from and go from there. Um, so I was kind of where like, all right, like I had some like there wasn't like again, I was gonna have either way, I was gonna have to make my own path of advancement in some kind of ways. And decided I kind of wanted to take a different approach. I had some like opportunities to do some not huge, but some like projects where I was like, this could be sort of a starting point to build on. So I'm not just leaving and then going to like, all right, now I'd figure everything out, right? At least there's like something I could like spend some time on. So that's kind of part of it. It was like it felt a little more natural than maybe you might see where it was like, I'm already doing this kind of work. There's kind of opportunities there. I think at that point I sort of recognized my skill set was as somewhat of a generalist, and I think I've always get this consulting aspect's always been a little bit of where things have grounded. So why don't we like try this out and see where it goes from there? And I've never felt like, again, I'm very attracted to sort of the like entrepreneurial sort of like thing, but I've never thought that's a goal in of itself. It's like for me, it's always I'm going to work on like problems that are interesting that I feel like I'm capable of solving or might have a unique way of looking at things. And this is how I found was like I felt like I can help other companies, organizations, other people learn this stuff, apply it in different ways. And a lot of what I get most excited about is I think behavioral science is a way of looking at the world. It's a way of solving problems. It's a way of like working in its own way. And in that sort of sense of impact, I was like, maybe there's a way where I can just help other people do this kind of thing and help solve problems in this kind of way. And maybe they'll turn into a steady job at some point, maybe not, but this is kind of a way to try that out, see where it goes. And there's a time in my life where I was like, there's not gonna be too much time. It's getting riskier and riskier as time goes on and trying this kind of thing. So I was like, maybe the time is now.
And so, and it has largely been successful. I mean, you've been at this for more than 6 years, about six and a half years, right? Like, are you liking it? What is one thing that has been unexpectedly challenging, and what's one thing that's been unexpectedly awesome?
Great question. I do still like it. And it has been going pretty well. I mean, there's been stops and starts. I left Morningstar in 2019, and I had some early projects, but I wasn't like in a big hurry to get super busy right away. Did a little bit of traveling, stuff like that. And then when I kind of really got it ramped up, this was like early 2020, which in hindsight was not a very good time to try to start doing your own consulting. Because as we all know, and like, by March 2020, like everything was kind of shut down for a little while. So there was a period of time where I wasn't like super busy, but also gave me time to think about stuff a little bit more. And then as I constantly thought about that, and I ended up getting some initial projects again and building from there. Um, and what I think like maybe a surprising thing that I found is that I kind of envisioned, in some ways, this is just how things worked out. I kind of envisioned like, oh, I'd have a bunch of these different clients working on all these different projects, and I'll be able to help me out. What's kind of ended up happening is I found a lot of opportunities. I think there's a couple of surprising things. For one, I've ended up finding a lot of opportunities. It's more of this like, all right, it's not this like always defined project. They're like, hey, we need somebody to do this thing. You can be, and I do it's like a contractor kind of basis where it's like, I work with companies like, hey, we want to stand up more of a customer research function for this thing that we're building. And behavioral science is a great way to approach that. So I kind of help like stand up that function with the behavioral science element. And it's not like a defined like deliverable project. It's like, all right, you're a contractor with this many hours a week, and you work on the time and do it. So I'm kind of a part of the team. I'm providing this really like functional service, right? So I've ended up finding a lot of success with like roles like that, where I kind of spend I have a good base of time where I'm working on with this one company, this one particular project. And then, as other smaller projects come up, I'm able to do those, or I'll do like workshops, trainings, things like that. So I felt that that's a pretty like good approach, and that you can work on it different ways, but you don't always have to be chasing like tons of clients and stuff like that, or like always be doing this development. That is a way to do that. If I want to focus more on like growth, like that would be kind of a way to do it. But I don't know, just like a solo consultant, that's worked out pretty well for me. Um, I'd say another like maybe something I didn't anticipate, but that I makes a lot of sense as kind of advice I give is that most of the opportunities that I've gotten through that have not strictly been for behavioral science. It's not somebody that's like, hey, we need a behavioral scientist to do this thing. It's more of like through my network, somebody needs like one of them is like, hey, we want a growth marketer to figure out how to like get more people using this internal product. Or hey, we need somebody to like do really strategic customer research for this thing that we're building for customers, clients, things like and again, she's that. It's like I can do that, but I do it with a behavioral science angle. So I'm kind of meeting this core need that they have, because behavioral science is not the core thing they're looking for, but behavioral science is the way of doing the thing they're looking for. It's always been a really big selling point, and it's been a big differentiator in kind of like those kind of things. So I don't know. Those kind of the two like surprising things that like right now I'm doing a little more core behavioral science work, but in a lot of ways, and this is generally my advice to people, again, is like figure out what your sort of like core thing is. Like, do you like design? Do you like data? Do you like running experiments? And what's that thing? And make sure you have that core skill set, which is something that the good test is like, are there job postings for this thing? Right? Because there probably are job postings just for behavioral scientists. But when you can do these kind of core functions and say, hey, I do it in a unique way, or I take this behavioral science approach, I found that's been successful for me, and I think that's a good approach in general. That it's kind of an enhancement of these things that people are looking for. Because when you find a lot of like people really interested in behavioral science, they find it really fascinating. They can tell it can be useful. They still don't know quite what they want from it. They don't know what that means practically. So there's other ways where, you could do behavioral science that are all these ways they've been able to identify it. And those are kind of the good entry points to get in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can, I think it's been a shift in the field to start to understand the sort of like blank plus behavioral science rather than behavioral science as its own thing. Um, because it is a way of working, right? Like behavioral science is a thing you do, it's a verb, right? Um, and so I think that's been a really valuable contribution, and I think Action Design Network, was a part of that, right? Like even in the name, there's sort of this like, hey, there's like a more verby version of this. It's not,
Drive an action. Yeah.
yeah, it's not an academic study of a thing, right? It's not the, hey, we're going to explain the mysteries of all mankind and what makes us behave the way we do, or rationally, whatever, whatever, whatever. Like, however, academia wants to decide that it's going to define itself. Um, Being in that more applied space, I think, is a really valuable thing. What do you think? Where do you think you take it from here? Do you think like this continues for some more time? You're happy doing this sort of like fractional behavioral science stuff? Do you think you'll go back in? Is there a opportunity out there that would tempt you in, right? If this came along, you'd jump on it?
Yeah. I mean, right now I've kind of got good like sort solid, stable work with some people I'm working with. And I'm pretty happy with that. I'm also kind of a busy time in my life. Like I have a 2.5-year-old. I have another one coming on the way in a month or so. So in some ways, it's like our stability is a little more just kind of valuable right now than like thinking. I always have the time and energy to think about these broader next steps. But what I kind of mentioned before, what I think is probably a good heuristic just for like careers and stuff in general is like think about what's kind of broad like principle or vision that you're kind of excited about. For me, it's that getting back to what we were just talking about, like I think that understanding some broad understanding of behavioral science is really important for understanding ourselves. Um, like a lot of the initial interest that really kind of got me in this was studying myself and saying just like I want to work out 5 times a week, but I don't. Why is that? I'm not going to. I want to go to bed and get 8 hours of sleep, but I'm not doing that. Why is that? Um, so this I think just understanding ourselves and why we fall short in things we say we want to do helps a lot. And it's understanding like the problems that we're tackling at work, the problems we see maybe in like society or structurally, things like that. Like to me, behavioral science is like a very good rooting discipline for like understanding all that stuff. And it's like, hey, people think and act in strange, surprising ways that are not always like logical. And there's always something of that effect in like any kind of area or industry. And to me, like what I think to me, I think it's again, it's helped me understand myself. It's helped me understand like the world more broadly better. It's helped me tackle problems better. What I really want to do is help more people understand that, and think that way. Not much that's just like it's not just and again, it's not a correct way of thinking. It's just a way of like understanding like, hey, people are weird and we're quirky and like we don't understand ourselves that well. And I think the more we can help people understand themselves, the teams they work with, the customers they're trying to serve, the social problems they're trying to tackle. I think it's just such a good grounding for how you tackle those things. And really, there's just so much opportunity. Like most of the world still at this point is not very well designed for humans. I think there's so many ways we can just make the world just easier and more fun to navigate by just making them like designed for humans, right? So I just try to think of it like I don't think about like, oh, I want to be self-employed. I want to be run my own thing. I want to do. I just think about, hey, where are there opportunities to tackle interesting problems where I think using this framework and mindset can, help me solve problems and also help others solve problems. So that's kind of the vision I try to take. And at this point, it's I don't know. I think I'm at a point where it's like there's not a really specific step I need to take. It's just more, hey, where's there opportunity to keep doing this, helping people do this kind of thing more often, and what's the best way I can do that? And I've sort of like we've talked before, like I have sort of maybe I don't have I don't have this like core academic background. I don't have this like traditional background. And in some ways, like that's a weakness. In some ways, there's always some things where like I don't fit certain job descriptions and stuff. But I've kind of leaned into that as sort of my strength in some ways. That like I had to learn this myself. I've had to figure out how to make it practical for myself. Um, I'm not the one who's gonna be able to run this perfect like RCT and like do the whole thing, but I can help take your approach and figure out what that is. I can help you like figure out and connect you to the right picture how to do that kind of thing. So that's what I just want to do is like spread knowledge of this stuff, spread this way of like thinking, understanding people. Because I think it's just really, really important for, making the world better.
Yes, absolutely. And what a nice way to conclude the episode on that reminder that sort of, I think your career has been and particularly the work outside of your career, right? Action Design Network and the important role that you've had in bringing people together, is sort of a love letter to the fact that, you actually think this works, right? We're not doing it
Yeah,
because
I'm
we like
passionate about it. Yeah,
networking.
it's genuine. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
it's not, I think sometimes I like you, I shy away from the word networking because there's so many young people who they think the action is the outcome, right? I talked to this person and so I did the thing, right? I did the thing that was networking, right? And I'm like, no, man, like that is a method that you use to cause another thing to be true, right?
Yeah,
And I think that thing that both you and I share very powerfully is, I do think the world gets better if people use more of this, right? I think,
yeah.
you know,
And
I,
that's where, again, like I don't love the networking makes it sound so technical or whatever, but it's really just been making friends, and like I think the behavioral science community is not that large. It's like it's smaller than you think. Like kind of once you meet a few people, you realize like, oh, I'm only like 1 degree away from Nobel Prize winners and stuff. That's kind of crazy. But just the people in this community are just really cool because we're all united in this core interest in other people, right? And it's just like fun, the fun, easy to engage with group. It's not super like everybody's kind of working in so many different things. There's not like this big competitive aspect to it in a lot of ways. Like it's a really good community to get into, and it's just yeah, for me it was just fun. It was always fun to talk to people about this, and to find people to think about these things these ways that I do. So yeah, it's not number. It's making friends and just like bonding over a shared, passion and interest.
there you go. Erik Johnson, still having fun.
Still
Thanks
having
so much
fun.
for coming on and spending some time with us. I think uh, it can be so bewildering because it is a small field, because there are not that many people, because it's not something that necessarily everybody, it's your high school guidance counselors probably didn't tell you about it. It didn't probably come up on your aptitude test. The stories of people are so important. And so thank you very much for sharing yours. I know you're busy. It's a busy season of life. You've got things coming on, which is
I appreciate when we
exciting.
were trying to schedule. I was like, oh, let's try to get this in before mid-January because I want to be a little MIA for a little bit after that. So it's ended up working out well.
Awesome, exciting stuff. I mean, I think so many behavioral scientists end up being parents. And I think there is some part of that like love of sort of like exploring the world alongside other people. It is a very communal thing that I think leads us here. So exciting news for you. Thank you for sharing your story, and I look forward to seeing what comes next for you.
Same. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. It's always fun this. Always great chatting.
Awesome. Thank you, Erik Johnson, sharing your story on Internet of One.
Thank you.